The Rebel Capitalist Show.
Let's start with this series that you have on your podcast. So we'll call it I think it's Our BS Economy. Where are we with that? And what are your more recent thoughts on the economy?
My thoughts are the same as they were 2 years ago, which is the more I learn about it, the more the global economy seems to be completely rigged and a Ponzi scheme. And the question that continues to persist is whether or not all of these man-made exceptions to basic economic laws and the collective cooperation of all the central banks globally can persist, and if so, for how long before natural laws and natural economic laws and the free market take over. And that's like the quadrillion-dollar question, right? The question is, if you got the buy-in of all the central banks globally, like right now they're talking about that great reset that they're going to do. If you got the buy-in of all of these central banks globally, and everybody's okay with playing the fiat game, and you don't have any defectors, although I think China may defect at some point, then how long can you make the con? How big of a long con can you make it? Can you make it 100-year con? Can you make it a 500-year con? Can you make it 1,000-year con? The idea of taking the dollar off the gold standard is a big deal if one of these other countries decides they want to call us on it. But what happens if everybody agrees that it's okay? Who knows? So there's no doubt. I saw last night a headline cross the wire that Kuroda said it's important that we continue to buy ETFs in Japan. And I was just thinking, okay, well, we're next here in the US. And so what road are we going down? We're going down a road where eventually the Fed is buying stocks. It's coming, if it's not already happening.
Yeah.
We're going down the road of there being nothing left to buy at some point if we continue to just do quantitative easing the way that we're doing it. And the longer these central banks persist in what they're doing, the less of a free market it becomes and the more of a cornered market it becomes by the central banks. And as you have one player that comes in and acts as a bid for everything, all of the other basics, price discovery, supply and demand, the things that drive an economy, all get thrown out of whack. And so, we're seeing that now with the government printing all this money and redistributing all of this purchasing power toward people that aren't working. Well, that's going to have a negative effect on productivity. There's going to be no incentive for people to produce products or services because of that. So the further the central banks get their hands on, wrapped around their respective economies, and the further all these global central banks collectively get their hands around the global economy, the less of an economy it becomes. And who knows what happens at that point. So the only question now is how long's the runway before the whole thing blows up? And we had a small glimmer of hope yesterday with the potential nomination of Judy Shelton to the Federal Open Markets Committee, which of course was swiftly batted down. One of the only bipartisan agreements our two parties can come to is don't mess with our central bank Ponzi scheme that we have going on, with our central bank scam. And that is, of course, why I have often said the Federal Reserve is the actual deep state in the United States. It is when you have an entity that both parties kind of agree that they don't want to mess with, that they want to leave as the status quo, well, that should be alarming to everybody. And that's why I think the Fed is the real, and central banks are the real deep states globally.
What I've been thinking about a lot lately is this idea of a debt jubilee. And I think that if you go through the thought experiment, it takes us right back to what you were talking about with the BS economy. I did a video the other day where I put some numbers together, and I found that currently government spending in the United States is about 57% of GDP. You think about that and you're like, okay, at what point, where's the line in the sand where we just admit, okay, it's socialism or communism or whatever title you want to give it. And then you juxtapose that to before the Fed was created, and government spending as a percentage of GDP was 3%.
Right.
3. Right. So that means the private sector accounted for 97% of the economic output. So which economy do you think is doing more to benefit the average person, the rich, everyone involved? You know, an economy where the government is producing 97% or the private sector. It's obviously the private sector. So prior to COVID, we were at about 40 or 45%. And because GDP has gone down, nominal GDP, and government spending and deficit spending has just gone through the roof, you know, that's what's taken us up to maybe 57% roughly. But, you know, if we keep going to 70%, 80% of our economy is government spending, I mean,
well, we're going to see
what does that look like?
Well, I think what it looks like is you're going to see a drop in the quality of living, right? I mean, that just doing back of the napkin, you know, trying to figure it out in my head right now as we're talking about it for the first time ever. I mean, as a function of GDP going down and spending going up, so you're talking about less production and more spending, and then you're talking about that spending taking away from the private sector and capital being allocated by the government. What that looks like to me in my head is a much lower standard of living. It looks like crumbling infrastructure. It looks like less choice for the consumer. And it looks like a step toward all of the things that you would see in a socialist planned economy versus what you would see in a free market economy, right? I mean,
that's basically how communism failed. One of the main reasons is they just couldn't allocate resources well. And, you know, we've got a finite amount of resources.
And that's why all these socialist planned economies and communist economies always wind up not having access to the things that you need to live, right? Like bread and toilet paper. Right. I think one of the biggest disconnects for socialism and communism is that they don't have an understanding of history, not only how those ideologies have played out over the course of history, but the sacrifices that our country has made and other countries have made to fight those ideologies specifically. I mean, the world wars that were fought against communism and why, right? That's number one. But number two is they don't understand how their quality of life would deteriorate if, you know, their ideologies took hold. They think it would be sunshine and rainbows and life would continue the way that it goes. And it would be Starbucks and Apple iPhones and playing the Xbox and choice between cable providers and always having 5G cell phone service and all these things that would eventually, slowly, but would eventually crumble over time. And people don't understand that until you get to the point where things deteriorate so bad that you can't get toilet paper, you can't wipe your ass, and you don't have bread to eat. I mean, and that's eventually how things deteriorate. It happens over time. It requires some critical thinking, which is why I think some of these groups don't really get it. But it's also why in this past election, we saw a place like Miami-Dade County turn so unexpectedly towards Trump, because the population of Miami-Dade, which is an area that is typically supposed to be a Democratic stronghold, is so robust with people who have fled communism in Cuba.
In Venezuela.
Correct. So they know firsthand where that road leads down because they've lived it. But these entitled numbskulls here in the United States that are fighting for this ideology, they don't really get it. And they're not going to learn either way. They're not really interested in learning. They're not going to learn anyway, but the hard way if it happens. Hopefully, like myself, like others that I know, hopefully they just grow up and they start to understand it. You know, they wrap their heads around it a little bit more, which helps them understand it. Because when I was in my early 20s, I was a fucking socialist anarchist too. I mean, I guess, I don't know what the hell I was doing, but I'm sure there was some part of me that was, hey man, you know, can't we all just love each other and we'll all plant the food together and we'll all grow it. It's like, it doesn't fucking work. You know, you get to a point in your life where you get a reality check And that's what I think a lot of these groups need.
I think if people just saw the goods and services as being quote unquote rich or a standard of living and didn't associate that with just these little green pieces of paper, which if you think about it, only have value because we believe they have value. Like Chris Cole says, they're a thought abstraction.
Right.
And I think if we could somehow shift people's thinking, that would really help, because to your point, in this socialist economy, the goods and services we have available to us will plummet. And
Right.
therefore, regardless of how much money the Fed can print or the government can spend, we're going to be poor as a result.